Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcast. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. And this is episode 47. Amazing that we're there already. Almost 50 episodes seems crazy, but there we go. So we'll continue on. Hopefully you found it interesting so far, and hopefully it will continue to be so. So we're coming back to, I was on uniform patrol still. I had recently become an acting sergeant, so I was in charge of anything from 25 to maybe 40 cops that were kind of working underneath me in conjunction with other sergeants and an inspector, and this is South London in the Met. So as I explained last week, my role was kind of firefighting effectively, and in fact one of the incidents we'll talk about tonight was almost exactly that. We've not really talked about fires much so far. It's something that you get involved with as a police officer quite often in some form or another, particularly if it's a large fire and it needs, it needs evacuations. If it's really that big and it's going to start affecting sort of neighbouring properties, then for sure you could be called on. And that's what happened on this night. I was by myself, as I quite often was in this sergeant role, driving around and making sure that all the other cops out there were kind of doing what they should be, but also that they were supported, and assisted through anything they weren't sure about. And there was a call to a bin fire at quite a large block of flats. And initially a couple of cars went, and they said that it was larger than expected. It wasn't just like a small sort of bin where you might put cigarette butts in. This was quite a large wheelie bin. In the US, I think you'd probably call it a dumpster, or something like that. It was quite a substantial bin, and it was pushed up against the outside of a building, and it was well alight. So initially they called the fire brigade. Obviously, because you'd be surprised how the police tend to get called for all sorts of things. It can be, a fire, it can be somebody's injured themselves, and yet people's first sort of instance is to ring the police. It's always surprised me that, you'd think, well, surely if it's a fire, you'll call the fire brigade, or, if somebody's hurt themselves, you call an ambulance, but it doesn't necessarily follow. But it doesn't really matter, because whoever gets called, obviously, all the control rooms are in close contact with each other, so you just simply contact the other sort of emergency service that's required and make sure that they're also coming out to what the incident is. So initially the two cops just stood by. Apparently they tried to use their fire extinguisher from the car on this bin, but it was well alight, and like I said, it was really quite substantial, so they had a go, but they were never going to be able to do anything with it. And fire brigade were there fairly quick. I think within kind of 5 minutes or so there was a station quite nearby. The only problem was, by the time the fire brigade got there, the second wheelie bin that was also alongside the one that was initially alight had also gone up. So now what was already a reasonably decent fire was now growing quickly, and the cops had actually tried to push the wheelie bin out of the way, but unfortunately the brakes were on, and the heat was so intense they couldn't get near it. And this block of flats, if I remember right, had about 6 flats in it. So, you potentially had quite a few people affected, and this was in a very urban area, with other flats and buildings around it. And also there was like a commercial yard that was next door to the flats, but we weren't really clear what was in there. There was no signs up, and we couldn't really, figure out what it was. So it took a little bit more digging to figure out what that was. Fire brigade had turned up. They started to put the fire out, but by now a third wheelie bin had gone up as well. So it really was quite a large fire, and we'd gone through and started to evacuate the building. And you'd think that would be easy, but actually, it's not quite as easy. Some people come out immediately as soon as you sort of shout fire. Other people will start questioning, well, how bad is the fire? Is it a big fire? Because I've just put my tea in the microwave, I've just boiled the kettle, or I've just run myself a bath, and you're like, I don't think you understand, this is really quite a large fire that could, really ruin your day and may well burn you alive, so you might want to leave. But people kind of wanted to argue the toss with you, which always surprised me. And also, of course, there's things like, obviously, young kids that potentially have gone down to sleep or in bed, so they have to be woken up and got out. Certain amount of chaos there. And also animals as well. People will not leave dogs, cats, etc. So they're busy trying to gather up, cages and, pet belongings and things before they'll come out with you. So it's actually harder than you think. And then, initially I went down and spoke to the fire brigade and said, I take it it's just this area. And they said, well, we've got a bit of a problem. And this is where it took a little bit of a turn or a twist. They'd been up on a ladder trying to get above the fire to the bin area so that they could get, sort of their water directly down on top of it. And they'd been able to look over to the yard next door. And what they hadn't realised, and what none of us had realised, was there was a large amount of gas bottles stored in that yard, and they were right up against the wall. Now, fire brigade had sort of touched the wall and had established that it was really quite warm. So they were now concerned about the gas bottles. And I was thinking, brilliant, this is like one of those scenarios, that happens in a sergeant's exam where, in a minute we're going to have like a petrol tanker that's going to end up bursting its tyre nearby and slew off into the road. They kind of just keep throwing in all these unlikely scenarios. So there was a big issue with the gas, and they said they already think that the gas had got up quite a high temperature, the cylinders themselves. And when I said to them, it was kind of, how hot do they have to be, before the gas starts going off? And they said, well, they wouldn't be drawn on it for an exact answer. Very unstable. You can never tell. Could already be too hot. Could go any minute, And you're like, all right, okay. So what we're talking, And they were like, well, I think it needs a 100-metre cordon. And you might think 100 metres, that's not too bad, Well, it may be not in a, in a rural area or a place where, you've got a housing estate with perhaps detached houses that are all spread out. That might only be, half a dozen houses. But unfortunately, we're talking about South London here, a very, very urban environment. And in actual fact, when we looked at the map and we went out about 100 metres on the map, I was pretty shocked and called up the inspector and said, we're going to need a lot more cops here, because not only is there large amounts of blocks of flats around us, we've got all sorts of things going on. Schools and nurseries. We were right on the edge of a hospital as well. We were sort of, that 100 metres was coming into the edge of where a local hospital was too. So it just got better and better. It was one of those days. We had to go to the hospital. Eventually we had to move people from one corner of the building over to another side, so they were far enough away. We had to evacuate lots and lots of flats. There was all sorts of people that we had to dig out of their addresses, and of course all the dramas that goes with that we've already talked about, plus a lot of people, won't answer the door, especially when they see it's the police, for various reasons. So quite a difficult one, and we ended up being there, not me personally, but the police, for something like 24 hours, because the issue is, even though the fire was out, they thought that the gas bottles got sufficiently hot, even though they were trying to spray water on them, that they would need, some time to cool down. And then, of course, they were saying, well, there might be combustible material as well in there. We're not too sure about that, so let's just leave the, the cordons on. And you can imagine how this affected, the rest of the cops coming on duty, because, as we talked about before, when they came in for their briefing to get assigned their roles, I mean, this scene was massive. It needed something like 15 cops to keep the cordons on, to keep that 100 metres sterile. And of course, you have all the issues where people are then saying, well, I need to get back in my house, and you'd be like, well, you can't, you're going to come within the cordon, it's too dangerous. And initially there'd be, it might be for a reason that wasn't, particularly great. Well, I need to go and get my whatever, but once people start then saying, well, I've got my medication and it's vital and I've got to have it in the next, 10 minutes or whatever, becomes a lot more difficult. Then you have to start trying to arrange to get people, to escort them to addresses and things. All in all, it's, even a small fire, and certainly if it involves evacuations, can bring big problems, and lots of headaches. But eventually, after 24 hours, it was all cooled down enough. Thankfully, there was no injuries, and that was it sorted. But it was just another example of, having something different. And I was on late shift at that time, so I was meant to finish, I think, at 2 in the morning. I ended up going right through till I think it was mid-afternoon the following day, and that wasn't unusual. So quite often you could end up doing, certainly I think my longest shift is about 24 hours, but I've certainly done shifts, 18, 19, 20 hours as this one was. So the following night I was back on, and the fire was all sorted, and I was back to my acting sergeant role. I was in the car by myself, and the next night was a Friday night, so we had all the nightclub issues that we've had before. And I was by myself driving around the town. It was the early hours, and we had lots and lots of police out, because we're obviously trying to stop the fights. And as we're driving around, I could see, I came onto the one-way system, which led past 2 or 3 of our sort of biggest clubs. Now, normally you'd have lots of police vans and cars there, but there was a bit of a fight, if I remember right, or some trouble nearby. But the other side of town, so a lot of the cars had gone to that. So I was by myself, came round the one-way system to find a lot of people in the road, bit of pushing and shoving, some screaming, some dramas, but not really clear what was happening. We'd had no call about it at all. I'd just come across this. So I got out of the vehicle, and the first thing I did was put my blue lights on, because I thought, well, they'll see me on the cameras. And I was a bit concerned that if I'm by myself going to go into the middle of this crowd and find out, what's happening, I really want my colleagues to be able to find me quite quickly, because in the early hours with lots of drunk people in a busy city that's got a bit of a reputation, I was aware just how sort of vulnerable I was. So I walked into the middle of this crowd, and as I was getting more to the centre of it, I could see there was someone laying on the floor, and there's a bit of screaming, a bit of pushing and shoving. And I must admit, at this point, I was thinking, please tell me this is not going to be a similar scenario to the night bus that we talked about a few episodes ago. And unfortunately, that's exactly what it was. When I got to the guy in the middle, he was down on the floor. He was, pumping blood everywhere and had been stabbed, multiple times. So I'd put it up on my radio, and I'd had to get some urgent assistance to me at that point, because I was really, really feeling vulnerable. In the middle of this big crowd by myself. I'd not had a chance to put up my exact location. I was glad that I'd turned the blues on and hoped that the CCTV operators, were switched on enough that they would see where I was. And it was very much a carbon copy of the previous incident we talked about off the night bus. I still had my trusty roll of masking tape with me, black tape, black nasty as we used to call it, gaffer tape, and I basically started tearing strips off the gaffer tape and trying to plug the holes, but it was very, very difficult because he was bleeding so heavily. He was unconscious, and he'd obviously only recently been stabbed. I wasn't being spat on or punched this time. There was just a lot of screaming and excitement around me. But sure enough, within about what seemed like ages, as it always does, in actual fact, it was probably only a minute or two. I had lots of colleagues there, although that concerned me because initially I just saw dark figures, people in black jackets pushing their way through the crowd, and I didn't know, was this gang members coming to finish the job off? Was this, family? Who was this? I didn't know, and I couldn't see that clearly, but thankfully it was colleagues. So other cops were able to get in there and help me. There was nothing could be done for the guy, and unfortunately, almost certainly, again, much like the last incident, by the time I'd got involved, he was probably dead already, having been stabbed repeatedly. So we got the ambulance there, and they actually carried out some fairly horrific surgery right on the street there, which is always a shock because, again, you expect, people to be patched up and taken off, but they said that they were pretty confident that he'd been stabbed in his heart, and there was just a chance that they might be able to do something for him initially. So they rather brutally cracked his chest, as we call it, right there and then. We basically held up jackets so that, and had pushed, but by now we'd pushed everyone back, but we held up jackets to form a bit of a shield so people couldn't see what was happening. But effectively they cut him down the middle of his chest, and then they used a rib spreader, which is a very sort of medieval looking machine that they it has a sort of almost like a ratchet system on it, and it's basically able to open ribs up And then they were HEMS medics, which is the sort of helicopter medics, although sometimes they're in vehicles, as they were this time. And they were able to, once they'd cracked his chest open, actually put their hand inside his rib cage and physically get hold of his heart, which they could see. Well, I don't know how they could see anything, quite frankly, because to me it was just, you know, an absolute mass of blood, and you know, it just looked horrendous in there. But obviously these guys and girls thankfully know what they're doing, and one of them literally put his hand inside the guy's chest and started doing heart massages, you know, with his hand direct onto the heart. And this is very much a kind of all or nothing. You know, it's a horrific thing to see, and of course massive risk of terrible infection because you're doing it on a dirty street. But this was literally the only chance the guy had. But unfortunately, after about 10 minutes or so of this, it was very apparent to them as well that it just wasn't going to work, you know. But they did try, in fairness, and that's all you can do ultimately. So this became, unfortunately, another murder scene in South London, something that I was becoming used to. And this came within about a month. All of these incidents came within about a month of each other. So firstly, we had the night bus murder. Then I had the CPR, the unsuccessful CPR that I did on the pregnant lady, and then this. And I must admit, by the end of this shift, I was very much feeling like, wow, you know, this place is going to turn me into a basket case. You know, this stuff just keeps coming at me. But this then becomes a full-on crime scene, and you have the murder squad come out. Obviously, all your tape goes up and people are pushed back. All the paramedics leave all their equipment there and then, because, as we talked about before, you may well find that there is forensics on the items of, you know, bandages and paramedic bags and defib machines and all sorts. You know, you could have splashes of blood or matter, you know, that could have come from an offender. So forensically, the scene literally gets left as it is. And that's quite hard to manage, you know, at 3 o'clock in the morning with limited cops. And obviously very distraught friends and family have now come down to the scene, because with the power of social media, sometimes before we could even give death messages, you know, you had people, mums and dads, brothers and sisters on scene, knowing that their son or daughter, but mostly son, I have to say, you know, had been stabbed, and maybe they already knew that they were dead, you know. So it was a pretty horrendous scene to manage. But we did what we could. And, it was, eventually they did catch the guy as well. And it had happened something like 2 minutes before I came around the corner. It had happened, you know, standard thing, people drinking, taking drugs, nightclub closes, everyone spills out into the street, opposing gangs. Somebody, you know, says something, or there's some beef, you know, between them. And before you know it, this guy's getting stabbed repeatedly. Unfortunately, it's an all too common scene in London, and probably, in fairness, you know, in cities around the world. So that was that. And this continued on, that incident was dealt with, and I continued on being an acting sergeant for about another year. So by now I'd been in the Met for 2 years. I know we're jumping ahead a bit, and obviously there was other incidents, but we've covered, you know, some of the bigger ones at that point. And I was lining up nicely, or so I thought, for getting full promotion, you know, no longer being an acting sergeant. I hoped to be a full sergeant. And then from there, who knows, you know, maybe on to an inspector or whatever. I'd done a year on team as a PC, and then I'd done a year acting, you know. And at the end of that year, I was asked to formally apply to be a sergeant and to complete the form. At the time, I think the form was called a TOBAR form, and it stood for something. The police love an acronym. TOBAR stood for something, I can't remember what it was, to be honest with you. But so you have a series of examples, written examples you have to give about your time as an acting sergeant and why you feel, you know, that you should become a full sergeant. And on top of that, and this is the procedure as it was, but these things change all the time. It's changed again now. In fact, it changed the following year after I'd carried out this or gone through this process. So I filled it out as best I could, and then some of my other sort of full sergeants that I've been working with also filled out some sort of witness type forms to say that they'd seen me performing, and that, you know, as far as they were concerned, I was doing a reasonable job. My inspector had said that, you know, he had no concerns with me becoming a sergeant, And overall, I was quite pleased. I had quite a decent write-up. Well, bizarrely, at the time, it was later on this change. In fact, I say the following year it changed. But at the time, it was actually the head of HR, a civilian, that decided who got promoted in this particular area. And she went through my form, and ultimately I got feedback that I hadn't been successful and that she personally didn't feel I was ready. Well, it's fair to say I was a little bit miffed at this. I thought I'd done a reasonable job of acting sergeant for the year, and so did my fellow sergeants, and also the inspector had really good write-ups, had good evidence, and to be told by her that she didn't think I was ready, I think annoyed doesn't really start to cover it, but you get the idea. So I wasn't very impressed, and around about now I was pretty disillusioned with the whole thing, but thought really the only choice I had was I just have to stick it out for another year, even if it meant going back onto team as a PC for another year and then reapplying the following year, because you could apply every year. And I thought, well, perhaps I'll just have a better opportunity next year. And in fact, bizarrely, what happened the following year was exactly the same thing, only they changed the rules so that now it was senior officers that made the decision as to who got to become a sergeant. No longer HR or civilian post decided that. And in fact, the process the following year, because they changed the format, didn't go very well, to the point that there was a lot of complaints from cops that had applied to be sergeants that it wasn't fair and that some people had got through and some people hadn't. And in the end, the sort of higher echelons decided that we've made a bit of a hash of it this year, and what we'll do to make it fair is everyone that had applied, which was 600 PCs, for sergeant in that year will automatically get it. So I often think, I wonder, I'm a great believer in fate, and I wonder what would have happened, because the reality was, had I not taken the next path that I had, I would have reapplied the following year and therefore would have, sort of got the sergeant's role. And from there, who knows? Like I say, sergeant, inspector, who knows? But, it's not worth thinking about because it didn't happen. And I went on to a really good role. Basically what happened was, because I was so hacked off, quite frankly, that I'd been turned down, I'd done this great big long application, which I thought was, quite a good one at the time. And I saw an internal advert within the police for a job on the Marine Policing Unit based on the River Thames on the boats. And I thought, wow, that looks a good opportunity. And I spoke to a couple of people about it where I worked, and they all said, yeah, I'm sure it's a great job, but there's absolutely no point in you applying. If you don't know somebody there, then forget it. It's dead man's shoes. Basically people get that job, they stay in it for 20 years, then they retire. And that's the only time posts come up. And unless you know someone who's going to sort of, speak to somebody for you and tell them that you're okay, you're never, ever going to get it. But I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. So I basically changed the wording ever so slightly on my sergeant's exam, and then cut and paste my sergeant's, my application, cut and pasted my sergeant's application straight into this Marine unit and fired it off and forgot about it, because everyone said it's a waste of time. So I fired it off, and that was that. And what happened at the time was, and this is still the same now throughout the police, there are lots of internal jobs advertised within the police, so you have to be a police officer already. But whether it's, to be a detective or to be a traffic officer or to be, an officer safety trainer or pretty much any role within the police, they all advertise internally and give people the opportunity to apply for those things. And that's what happened on this occasion. So I put my application in and obviously, waited to see what happened. And amazingly, I got through the paper sift, which I was quite shocked at, bearing in mind everything I'd been told about the fact that I wouldn't get it. And then from the paper sift, I went on to actually get a board. So the next process is that you get called up to the unit, and the unit is based at a place called Wapping, which is on the River Thames. That's where the Marine Policing Unit base is, near Tower Bridge. And you sit in front of the board. Now, the board consisted of, for me, it was one of the inspectors from the unit. I think it was a chief inspector and maybe a superintendent from somewhere central. And they ask you a series of questions. It's a bit like your application form, really. It's asking you to kind of develop on that application form. And they'll ask you, well, tell us, they'll give you areas that they'll be covering. So they'll say on the day, we'll be looking at these 5 different areas, and it changes all the time. So those 5 areas could be things like communication, resilience, leadership, things like that. And they will ask you, so give me an example of a time when you've shown leadership, so you have to come up with, for all the areas I was asked to look at, which I think was 5 areas, I had sort of 2 examples of each. And then I also had some spares that were a little bit generic that I could probably think on my feet and fit into whatever it was I was being asked for. So I walked into this massive office on the day, obviously quite nervous like everyone was. And I knew that there was something like 10 posts being advertised, but I also knew that there was over 100 people being interviewed. So I really didn't think I had much of a chance. But I went into this big room, this big office at Wapping, and it was on the first floor, and it had a massive bay window that looked straight out into the Thames. So you could see all the boats and the river traffic and everything happening out in the river. And I have to say I found it really interesting. But I tried to not focus on it, even though it was in my line of sight. And I sat down, and the opening line from the inspector was, just try and relax then, we'll do an icebreaker, tell us a bit about yourself, how long you got in the job and what have you, and we'll ask you a series of questions. If you get stuck at all, then just tell us, sorry, can you repeat the question, or I've forgotten, what you were asking, or, we'll just repeat it. It's all very relaxed, and try and chill out. Of course, you just absolutely can't, this is a job interview with knobs on. This is, quite nervous stuff. So the first thing he asked me was, okay, so icebreaker, just tell us a bit about yourself and how long, and perhaps you could tell me, and I can't remember what it was now, but he'd asked me something specific, perhaps you could tell us about, and it was whatever it was. And so I started off, and as I started talking, there was a big, massive rubbish barge that was being towed by a tugboat up the river, and these go up and down the river all day long, taking rubbish down to sort of down south of the river, and taking the rubbish away. And you get these sometimes three rubbish barges. They're massive and they're tied alongside each other. And it's quite a spectacle, and I'd never really seen it before. So as I was speaking, this caught my eye, and I found myself looking out on it. And then, of course, stupidly kicked myself because basically lost my train of thought, just sat there for a second and thought, I cannot remember where I was going with this, and I can't remember what he asked me. And I had to say to him, I'm really sorry. I know you said about, going blank. And I said, well, I have gone blank, I'm afraid. Can you just repeat the question again? And I just felt, a complete idiot. And I thought, that's it, I've screwed this up already. They're going to think I'm a right muppet. So he asked again, and I carried on, and I sort of got away with it. And it was an okay interview, but I didn't think for a minute I'd done enough, and then had to wait and see. And then, sure enough, 3 or 4 days later, I got told that I'd been successful, and that subject to some aptitude tests, I was going to be accepted onto the unit, and I was going to be on the Marine unit, which I was absolutely made up with. I just couldn't believe I'd got on. And there began the start of quite a lengthy process and an awful lot of training. And what we'll do is, as I've just seen the times getting on for 30 odd minutes, I'll stop there, and we'll continue on next week, and we'll talk about what those aptitude tests were and what the training was, which ultimately lasted about 2 years for the Marine unit in total, and it's sort of staged, but we'll talk about it more in detail next week. So hopefully you found that a bit interesting, a bit of a mixed bag in this one, a couple of incidents, the fire, and unfortunately another murder. And then obviously me going for the Marine unit and amazingly getting it, which started me off down a totally different path in my career. And once again, fate played a hand. So we'll speak again next week. But for now, take it easy. Speak soon. Cheers. Bye.